everyone, I am Gary, also known as Ardwulf, and welcome to Classless Characters. In this series, we discuss role-playing games. Today, we'll be labeling things, and we'll be talking specifically about costumed hero types with powers.
Aren't labels bad, Gary? And why would we label anything? And who are costumed hero types with powers? Halloween trick-or-treaters with stun guns?
We're discussing a genre, Pat. Genres are a very convenient way to discuss role-playing games and to discuss different settings and tones. We've used costumed hero types with powers because some companies have trademarked the name superheroes.
Holy lawsuit, Batman. Is that true?
Indeed, boy wonder, but we can talk about them. We must be careful when writing about them, however.
We'll be careful, Batman. In fact, we do have a standard disclaimer.
Role-playing games are conducted in a near infinite number of fictional genres, atmospheres, and narrative tones. Even if the game that you are running or playing has exactly the same genre and tone as some other game, its game master and players are different, and so its outcomes will be different. In RPGs, there are no universally correct solutions or even questions, because so much depends on any given group's approach and chemistry. Consideration of nuance is required. However, this is something the human species, the internet, and the hosts of this program frequently cannot achieve, despite their best efforts. Please forgive them all, and keep this in mind as you watch.
We'd like to thank Willie Muffin, also known as Ian, for our disclaimer this week. You can find information about his channel in our links below the video. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Pat. Everyone, remember to like and subscribe. And if you're enjoying the episode, please comment below. How about questions and stuff, Pat?
Audience, if you have a question during this live stream, please write question all in caps and then ask a question on this discussion, and we'll try to get to it at the end of the show. A super chat will guarantee your question gets answered and earn our eternal gratitude. All super chat shout outs and questions will get answered or called out at the end of the show. Tell me about labeling things, Gary.
Labeling things is a feature in which we discuss role-playing game genre, and we talk about various system options from a 20,000-foot level, and we discuss considerations that a game master and playing group might have when playing inside that genre. And what's our genre today, Pat?
Today we're talking about superhero games. There, I said it. If you don't hear from me ever again, you'll all know that a major Hollywood international media conglomerate has seized everything I own and thrown me in prison. But before that happens, Gary, tell us about the superhero genre in role-playing games.
So the superhero genre in role-playing games has quite a long history. The first superhero game to appear was 1977, a game called Superhero 1944, which was actually published twice, based on my information, in 1977. First self-published by the author, and then later picked up by the inimitable and legendary Luzaki, who has seemingly published everything, especially in the 1970s. As far as I could tell, the next superhero game was probably Villains and Vigilantes from 1979. That's a Jeff D game, and actually Jeff has resurrected it in recent years. But we probably... A lot of folks probably might feel that the superhero genre inside RPGs was probably birthed with Champions, which was released originally in 1981. Of course, Champions, did not lean on an established superhero universe. It kind of designed its own from the ground up. And maybe the first example of that happening outside comic book publishing itself. But there's also a couple of interesting games that released in the 80s as well, including Heroes Unlimited from Palladium, but more especially Marvel Superheroes, 1984 release from TSR, a very innovative and well-remembered game, and the slightly less well-remembered, but I think not less innovative, DC Heroes from Mayfair Games, which released in 1985. That system was eventually resurrected without the DC license as a game system called Blood of Heroes, in which form it may even still be available, but I have not had the chance to look into that. So let's start by talking about the unique challenges of the superhero genre. Pat, what do we feel about that? What are the unique challenges of playing or running a superheroes game specifically?
I think the first question you have to ask yourself is, as we had on our agenda, to IP or not to IP? That is the question, right? Mm-hmm. Are you going to play in an existing published comic book or other superhero universe? And is that what you're going to try to do in your role-playing game? And if you're going to do that, are you going to try to create that inside the game system you're playing, or are you going to play one of those games that have come out, right? I mean, that's the first big challenge. And they each have all those options, I think, have challenges to them. The IP games, period. How long do publishers usually publish them, Gary?
It depends. I mean, there's outliers, but typically a single company. I mean, this is outside of comic books, right? I'm
Sure,
kind
it's
of thinking
everything.
of the
Yeah,
whole phenomenon of licensed IP, but it's kind of rare for an IP licensed into RPGs to last longer than about 5 years. The Marvel and DC licenses specifically have passed through multiple pairs of hands. And I think it would be fair to say, and I think uncontroversial to say, that the receptions to those different, say, Marvel or DC systems have kind of been all over the place. Some of them have been very fondly remembered, and some of them are remembered as not being very good, shall we say.
So logically, your problem with playing an IP game is you don't know, especially if you're doing a campaign or something, you don't know how long it's going to be supported with whatever you purchase. And the next thing that comes out, if you have no idea what the system could possibly look like, what they're going to try to emphasize, etc. And generally speaking, anything that's supported is going to be about, like, for instance, there's, I forget who published it. It might be Free League. Probably not. The new Marvel Universe game that just came out.
Oh, that just came out. Yeah, I don't know, actually.
But we both know it's certainly going to be inside the movie universe, right? So it's not going to.
I think so. Maybe.
Right. My point is merely it's going to be current. It's not going to be like, I want to play this play style with these, from the Electrum era in the 80s or whatever, comic books. You're getting whatever is the current day, what the consumer wants out there. So it's got
the current interpretations of the characters, which in some cases, I mean, some of the characters I grew up with are still around, and sometimes they're in the movies, but the interpretations of those characters are somewhat different.
Right. So, but practically speaking, that's all about taste, right? What it comes down to is you don't know what you're going to get in terms of a role-playing system. It's going to be usually pricey, a lot of gloss, a lot of stuff, which is a plus or a negative, and you don't know how long the licensee is going to support the thing. So that's the issue with the IP or not IP. So the second question is, do you want to create your own universe or replicates? Let's take, for example, the Marvel universe in another system. So what do you think the challenges are with that?
Champions for decades, for example.
Right. You could make your own, right? Your own heroes, your own back universe, which, let's get real, I think as we move forward, that's our preferred style to play. That's what we would like to do, right? But if you tried to import an IP universe into that and like remake Scarlet Witch, Vision, et cetera, that's a lot of work. There's a whole lot of superheroes in that universe, and there's this whole, canon you're going to have to latch on to and replicate it in something like a point-based system, say like Champions or GURPS or something like that. So I think those are the unique challenges. I think the third challenge is probably how do we handle differing power levels? And that this is something I think that there's no perfect solution to. You've got point-based systems that by their essence say, hey, make a character. We've got all these mechanisms for you to make powers and different types of superheroes, right? And the idea is we're going to keep you all at, like, I'm making it up, like a 400-point character. Everyone's going to make a 400-point character. But is Batman the same point level character as Superman, or Green Lantern or the Flash? That's difficult. But the flip side is like, well, if you just let people make whatever characters they want, with X powers, let's take like Heroes Unlimited, for instance, and pull some powers out of there. You're going to have some real disconnects in some characters who have just vastly different power levels. There's a lot of expectation management that's going to have to go into both those things in order to pull it off. So I think those are the unique challenges. What do you think are some more?
Well, let me actually throw that back at you and ask about the different ways to approach the power level question, actually, because we have, on the one hand, we have champions, and I'll be honest, to me, at least in this genre, there's no contest between random character creation and points-based character creation.
No,
I'm
I agree.
100% come down. In other genres, it's completely different. Traveler, right? Perfect example. I'm 100% behind it being totally random. Here, I think the exact opposite. I think you want to have a character concept when you go in. So the differences then to me is something like Heroes Unlimited, or for that matter, Marvel Superheroes, which had a randomized character creation system. And I think DC Heroes, it's been a long time since I've handled DC Heroes, did not. But DC Heroes tried to scale power level logarithmically so that Superman might be a 200-point character where Batman might be a 100-point character, right? So it wasn't, though, you'd look at the power levels and see, it would be a vast difference, but you wouldn't necessarily see that as obviously in the point totals. And that's based on my recollection of how that system worked. To me, kind of I've never played or even really looked at Villains and Vigilantes. To me, kind of the archetypical random character creation, D&D style character creation, a superhero game is Heroes Unlimited from Palladium, where it is totally randomized. And I guess you could just, pick all the stuff if you want, but then I think we'll agree that you're going to end up possibly with balance problems resulting from that choice. But honestly, you were probably going to end up with balance problems anyway, right? Because it was random, right?
So I've played in several Heroes Unlimited campaigns back in ancient times in late 80s, early 90s. And we never, ever picked the powers or, did random things to get the powers. Everybody had a character concept and just built the character concept, within the rules of how many powers you get, what type of character you're making. The problem with that, which is a great discussion for whenever we do Palladium, right? As a system, not the Palladium role-playing game, is the rules and class bloat that you get into, and you're reaching into other books that Palladium's put out, like, oh, well, maybe I can solve this problem by having MDC rather than, the different damage systems out there in the rules, or let me pull into ninjas and super spies and bring that, into my Heroes Unlimited campaign as well. The class level system never really seemed to work well.
Let me ask that. Did Heroes Unlimited use MDC?
No.
Or did the new version, because there was a revision of that in the late 90s, maybe?
They very well could in the new version, but at that time, Heroes Unlimited was SDC. MDC was a thing for Mecha or Rifts.
Right. As far as I'm aware, they introduced that mechanic with Rifts. But
Palladium highly encouraged taking all their rule, like Ninjas and Super Spies has all these martial arts forms, so you could pull so it became this real like mishmash, mix and match sort of superhero game. What I found most unsatisfying were things like if you took in Heroes Unlimited, the power, so everything has to be quantified into powers. So since you're not building the powers like you would in a point-based system, everything is just straight up constructed, laid out for you. So if you had invulnerability, you're invulnerable, and it doesn't talk to, well, what do you mean by invulnerable? Like, is Superman really, I think Superman can get beaten up by certain things. There are certain cosmic forces. What do you mean by that? There was a section of powers you could take that were magical in origin, and it specifically said, hey, it didn't matter what resistances any of the other superpowers gave them. Like if you were paralyzed via a magical spell from the power subset of magic, it just took effect. So it's the problem with Palladium is if Kevin Ciambetta is not writing another supplement for you, you're gonna have disconnects with all these different miscellaneous rules by exception and things you're pulling into it. So that's the downside with Heroes Unlimited. It ultimately proved unsatisfying. I'm not saying we didn't have fun at times while playing it, but I'd agree with you. I think if I was going to start playing a superhero game tomorrow, and somebody said, "Hey, run a superhero game," we're going to have 5 players show up, I would probably say, "Let's play with champions." Let's use the hero system. I think it's we can talk a little later about GURPS versus champions, but I think champions 99% of the time is going to be the best choice in terms of doing anything you want to do within the superhero role playing. I'll be honest, I've never played Marvel Superheroes by TSR back in the day. Did you ever play that?
I did, and DC Heroes as well. Not for any extended period in either case, but I did play both of them. And I actually didn't like Marvel Superheroes at the time, and that was probably a bad move on my part. Because thinking about it, it is actually a pretty nifty system, pretty nifty and innovative system. And where I think DC Heroes shown was in the logarithmic thing. I think that was actually a really neat idea that was necessary for them to be able to handle the bananas power scaling curve that you see in DC comic books, where on the one hand you have the Boy Wonder, and on the other hand you've got Darkseid, right? I mean, how do you manage those in both systems? And I won't say that DC Heroes did that flawlessly, but I do think it was a credible effort and a very clever idea for them to handle it the way they did.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. I played it once or twice, and what I did, where it bounced off me was it felt too board gamey and less role playing game. And
this is the Marvel game.
No, the DC game.
The DC game. Okay.
The level of mechanics that you're throwing on there to try to replicate this very specific universe and what they think they quantified all the power levels at turned it into something that felt. I didn't feel like I was playing my character in and engaging with the universe. That there was a lot of there. I felt, some of it was the IP aspect. Maybe that's just a natural thing for me. I'm feeling a distance from playing this character, but just the mechanics were very. And I think we see this a lot throughout the history of role-playing games, period, where they're doing something very interesting from the ludography standpoint, but in terms of actually just playing your character, getting into a fight, whatever, it's like you're doing this thing that's accomplishing its mission, but it's too clever by half, and all the meta mechanics you're having about how to play, how to utilize these powers, these conceptual things that are happening, create a distance from you where, I found DC Heroes was great for like, let's just sit down and do a DC Hero Adventure one-shotty thing, but I would never want to play a campaign in it. How's that?
One thing I will say is that I think that the DC game got better support, not necessarily more support, but better support for the product line than the TSR Marvel Superheroes did. Some of the Marvel stuff was okay too, particularly that advanced set, which is almost a whole new game, to be honest. But that like the DC source books for Superman and Batman and the Legion of Superheroes and the Watchmen were really, really good, actually.
Yeah.
The adventures were weird. The adventures were all weird. I don't know that I liked any of those adventures. I liked the Champions adventures better.
I mean, when we start talking about Champions, I played a lot of Champions, and I played a lot of Champions adventures. I played the hero system independent of it even being about superheroes, and I don't recall ever playing in an actual Champions adventure. It was always like a homebrew campaign with homebrew encounters, and the whole point of having a point system.
I don't think we did either. I just read some of them, but so we never tried to emulate. We were probably to some degree emulating Marvel because that's what my friends and I at the time read. But it was not like, oh, here's Wolverine shows. I mean, we never did anything like that. It was always kind of in our own homebrew universe. And we had characters of a variety of different power levels, from, alien godlings that came down to, basically souped up ninjas. One of the banner characters from one of those campaigns back in the day was basically Super Ninja. So, I mean, we loved ninjas at the time. It was a ninja era. What can I say?
So let's talk a bit about moving on. So we both have basically said we prefer Champions. I think we would both prefer a point-based system for going after superhero RPGs. And we kind of touched on all the systems. So let's talk about one-shots, campaigns, and subgenres. What are your one-shot options and approaches? I've never done a superhero one-shot, be it a one session or one module arc or something. Have you played in anything like that?
Actually, I've run one-shots of Aberrant. So this was the it wasn't called wasn't formally part of the storyteller system, but it was basically the White Wolf House system, adapted first in Aeon to sci-fi, and that is the game that later became known as Trinity because there was a unpleasantness with MTV, which had Aeon Flux on at the time. And then they added a superhero component onto that, which was kind of backstory to the sci-fi game, which was Aberrant. And then I believe later they did a third game, which was the Pulp era, which was called Adventure. And I don't think I ever played Trinity / Aeon, but I actually ran demos at one point of Aberrant, and I had a good time with it. And I felt like it was a good system for one-shots. It was, you had kind of there's enough kind of structure there that you can feel like you have a real system to work with without really overbearing me too much. I could sort of ignore the finer points, as you might want to do in a one shot. You wouldn't want to necessarily intentionally blow off mechanics in an ongoing campaign, because that can end up causing unintended ramifications down the line. Honestly, I feel like for superheroes, if you're running a one shot, who cares what system you pick? I wouldn't want to use Mutants and Masterminds, because it would be I believe it's level based. At least the first edition of it was. And if that's still the case, then that's going to I think that's going to kind of feel unsatisfying to say, oh, you get your 7th level superheroes. I think if you're going to have that feature in your game, I think that lends itself better to a campaign format. But beyond that, I mean, who cares? Whatever system you want to use for a one shot, use for a one shot. There's one called With Great Power. There's a whole bunch of indie type titles that I think are perfectly amenable to superhero one shot or short shot plays, if you know what I mean, like say a 2 to 5 session game. No problem.
I would probably go the IP route or the indie route. I actually wouldn't go, the Champions route or something like that, because of the investment, the time and investment you'd have to put into both character creation, making characters with the players, as well as Champions. As I commented, to me, the problem with the hero system is the problem with GURPS, which is, what are you going to leave out? What are you going to do to get tone going, etc.? So it's easy to kind of leave a lot of that work behind and just go the indie route. You know what I mean? For a short shot or something like that. But I wouldn't, if I was going to run a campaign, I would use GURPS Champions 99% of the time and GURPS 1% of the time. So
and I think we're going to talk
about campaigns.
Let me say one more thing before we get to that. In that, I agree with you that I think I would lean away from the heavy points-based games for one shots and away from the lighter narrative based games for campaigns. So I think we're both fans of the hero system and or Champions and GURPS. So let's actually talk about where the sweet spots for each of those lie, because I feel like for superheroes specifically, I think part of the reason why you're saying you'd rather do Champions in many cases is that the sweet spot for superheroes specifically in the hero system is pretty broad. It handles a pretty decent variety of power levels smoothly, and both games will tend to break down at really high point levels. I think that's no mystery, right? But you kind of have like 500-point champion characters are like off the hook powerful, right? Where you need to get into 2,000-3,000 point GURPS characters to I think start to break the points. But those types of GURPS characters are not necessarily superhero characters, right? They're characters like Kim Kinnison from Lensman.
I would. So I think Champions absolutely hits the sweet spot for most of what and we'll talk a little bit more about like getting into the genres of superhero play and whatever you could, but from a broad brush standpoint, to me, Champion starts to lose a little bit of the hero system, begins to lose a little bit of fidelity at the lower point levels. So if you're trying to do something pulpy or gritty, or that relies on you've got characters like the Punisher, or oh my god, I'm gonna be kicked out of the former comic book fan club for life. The guy from Watchmen,
Rorschach.
Yeah, Rorschach, type of level.
Who's basically a dude in a trench coat.
Right. You start to break down a little bit at the low ends, where GURPS can handle the low end. I think provides fidelity at the low end better than Champions does. Once you've passed that, I think you should just use Champions. You know, and I don't think GURPS gives you any real benefit other than if you're going to do stuff like time hopping or interdimensionality. That's another thing GURPS lends itself.
Yeah, I think that's its own genre.
Right,
to be honest.
or you're doing superheroes that heavily relies on like things from the Mystic. You know, Matt, you fought what I'm saying. Like, you know, Champion's great for like, hey, make your power and define your power and provide the effects on your power, but giving you like how these other things, because we're talking about a very big genre when we talking about superheroes, right? You know, we could be talking about Doctor Strange or Iron Fist. You know, we're talking specifically about chi mysticism, or are we talking about like some generic supernatural? We're talking about black magic, you know, or voodoo, you know, all those sort of things. Yeah, you can replicate them. I'm just saying there are little bits of GURPS that pull me to those areas where a lot of those supplements have fine-tuned a lot of those things for a lot of those niche things that get pulled into what we would call superheroes. But by and large, I think once you pass that low level of fidelity that I was just talking about, I think, because I mean, when you're talking about the hero system Champions, you're talking about like a guns a killing attack. Yeah, you know what I mean? You know that, you know, if we're talking about a bunch of dudes with different types of equipment, GURPS handles a bunch of dudes with different types of equipment better and provides better distinctions between those types of equipment. Yeah, you know, as well as the point buy. But anything above that gritty low level, I think you're absolutely in Champions territory in providing the relative. Would you agree with that as a thesis before we move forward?
Yeah, sure. I'd say both systems have a sweet spot in power level terms,
Right.
where, and you know, Hero's kind of up here, and I think it's a bigger sweet spot where GURPS is kind of down here. Its sweet spot is at a lower power, encompasses at least a lower power level, but then above that, Champion scales or hero systems, what we're talking about for Champions purposes here. But Champions is the for those who don't know, the superhero game that whose system then later became the universal hero system, right?
Yeah.
I think the hero system sweet spot for superheroes in terms of power level is bigger, but it also starts a little higher than GURPS. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, that's you know, that's kind of where I am on it.
And
you
GURPS
know,
does gritty very well.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, if we were all making different types of superheroes, right? Champions is my go-to. If we were playing a Doctor Strange campaign, I might seriously think about GURPS. Yeah, you know, if that was the idea that all the players sat down and said, we're going to do something that's like a Doctor Strangey sort of thing, I might be, well, this is going to let me pull in a lot of other things. We can still have the point system and the powers approach to things, but I can pull a lot of stuff. So, but if I'm just, you know, if we're talking a pulp campaign, a Silver Age campaign, you know, gold, well, I should have said Golden Age for Silver Age, or Electrum, or even like a, you know, kind of a dark, tragic, grim, dark, you know, superhero campaign, I'd probably go with Champions. And I think the combat system's a little better for superhero comic book combat. In much better, I would say, in Champions. The flip side, of course, it's a very complicated system,
relatively speaking. Yeah, and I believe that mechanically it is less modular than GURPS too. So it's a lot easier to pair GURPS back to like a GURPS light complexity level. Which, I mean, you could just start with that and tack on what you need. It's a little harder to do that with Champions. With the combat systems, just kind of the combat system. And while you could scale the complexity up or down a little bit depending on what options you use, it's a little hard. It's not as intentionally modular as GURPS. But let me ask about that, because there's I think two different ways to approach like building a superhero universe, right, to play in.
That's what you're doing, right?
Do you create the kind of kitchen sink universe that we see from Marvel or DC, for example, where it's, you know, there's aliens and there's magic and there's alien gods and there's mutants and there's, you know, guys with fancy power armor and all these different things that could kind of be factors that factor into your campaign? Or And then maybe you run multiple campaigns throughout the course of your lifetime in the hobby based on that setting. Or do you take a step forward and hypothesize like there's like a single point of origin for superpowers, like Aberrant did, for example, and like say The Boys does right now.
Sure.
Is where do you land on that?
I think they're all valid. Nuance. Do whatever you want. They're all fantastic ways to approach making a campaign. I could get behind. One method is pick a time period, whatever that time period is. It could be present day, it could be the future, it could be the past. Pick a city, right? If it were me, I would actually pick a real city, not like call something Star City or something, because you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
We live in an age of the internet now where I can find resources about San Francisco in the 50s, and get a street plan if I wanted to run a campaign in San Francisco in the 50s or today or whatever, right? So get a city, make some heroes, make some villains, and just oil stain your way up. That's one way, right? Another way is pick one of the periods of comic books that you want to play and homage it. So like you could start in the pulp era, which isn't strictly superheroes. I mean, you can Batman kind of started off as like a pulp detective who wore a mask, but he was in a set of comic books and a style that involved, you could have throw some at the two-fisted pulp
huge
heroes.
Overlap with both the Shadow and the Spider, both of whom were around before Batman.
Yeah, I'm thinking even like some of the Lost Worlds types.
That's true.
That whole area. You could play a lot of games with that kind of stuff and do something in the pulp era. You could pick something Golden Age, just go fight Ratsies, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and have well, you got your bad guys there, right? You've got Nazi Ratsy bad guys.
Easiest bad guys in the history of bad guys.
Right, with superhero, stuff, and all right, great. You could do something very Marvel from the 60s, early, probably early 70s at latest, the Silver Age, with the fantastic powers and, some futurism, and bring some aliens into it, and, or something as simple as like Spider-Man. But that vibe, that feeling.
Or even emulating a specific comic, right? I mean, I think it would be very I don't want to say trivially easy, because it's all work, right? It would be pretty easy to say, okay, I want something like the Chris Claremont era X-Men, and kind of build around that, right? Very very interesting way to design a campaign, and you really never have to build out that universe beyond, hey, there's mutants, right?
I played in a campaign once back in the 90s, a Champions campaign, where we started off with a pulp campaign that we knew was going to become Golden Age.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody talking about building, like, how do you get a universe that feels as thick, or with the legend or the history or our canon, right? So we started off playing a pulp campaign. We played about 3 adventures. And so to give it as an example, I made a character who was called Son of Liberty. Okay, looked like a dude, like a Minuteman. Okay, and he had like a torch of liberty, and he was like a proto late 30s, like Philadelphia experiment, type of scientist working on like electromagnetic stuff. And it was like an electromagnetic manipulator, and he, went to, I even forget his backstory at this time, but fighting gangsters and stuff, pulp stuff, and it turned into fighting the Ratsies. A Golden Age campaign. So we played a few adventures, and then we stopped, and we started a Silver Age campaign. Now, some of the players had ties back to that pulp campaign. My character there didn't. I made I had a guy who, this is going to sound very familiar to anybody who knows Marvel Comics. I'll ask Gary to name who I kind of ripped off in this campaign when I get done with this story. But the guy was he was an ex-astronaut, and he was at an experiment with a scientist buddy of his. They were blowing up. It was a test of an alpha bomb, and the alpha bomb ended up accidentally releasing some extra dimensional radiation, and his buddy, the massively big-brained scientist to my character was, there was some Soviet sabotage. So he ran out to like figure out what was wrong with the experiment. My character went out to save him. They both were exposed. He actually had the very neat power of he could become two-dimensional. So he could like become invisible just by turning like this, as well as some other like
sideways, man.
Yeah. But some stuff in and out of dimension stuff, neat stuff with theoretical physics. And my character became like a big living diamond. So who is that character based off of, Gary?
Presumably the origin sounds like it's based on the Hulk.
No, the Thing. Well, the bomb part.
The running out to defuse the bomb or rescue the bozo in the trench. I mean, that's right out of the.
But the
ex-astronaut. It's not like they never recycled these ideas. Ex-astronaut makes me think of Hal Jordan, actually.
Ex-astronaut who becomes like this living diamond.
So there's the Man Wolf. Is that? I mean, there's also he was an astronaut.
The Thing.
Well, that's true.
Ben
that's
Grimm.
Like the only thing tying him is there's a spaceship involved at some point in the backstory.
No, he was the only astronaut. One, Ben Grimm was the only astronaut. Two,
well, that's
like
true. The only professional astronaut. They were all on the ship.
Yeah, and a big rock creature. Anyway, so that was our Silver Age, right? When we went and did at the what they call today, a lot of names for it, but like 80s to 90s, type of stuff, like the Chris Claremont era, whatever. I made another character called Son of Liberty, who was a scientist who stole a suit that the U.S. government was going to weaponize to use against the Soviets. That was based off the technology that Son of Liberty was working on, and so it was electromagnetic manipulating weapon suit. So we had a modern day scientist. So that whole idea of like start a campaign, run 3 adventures, start another campaign in another era, start another campaign in another era, can kind of build that legend out. You can combine that with the oil stain with one city idea too, and just like fast forward these heroes, So what's your experience with some campaigns here, Gary?
No, we never tried that. And I always tried to create sort of that kitchen sink type. And it's been 20 years since I've even tried this. And the last attempt, I think, was completely ignoring whatever game system. I just kind of was doing it for the sake of doing it. But a superhero universe is, in my experience, always about the characters, right? And there's probably some meta background in that of mine where it's like, hey, how I got to know the Marvel Universe was by reading the official handbook of the Marvel Universe that went through all that stuff on largely a character-by-character basis, right? So you had this sort of tapestry that is the universe, that is the combination of all of these hundreds or thousands or whatever the hell it was, probably thousands of different characters. And DC tried to do a similar thing, and it just wasn't nearly as good. DC did Who's Who, and I believe both the Marvel and DC games did either Who's Who for DC or Marvel Universe for Marvel as supplements to the game, and neither one of those efforts got very far. But I always tried to build it as the kitchen sink and that fit whatever I was trying to do.
Because it's the curse of the IP, because by the time they get to like the H's in the Marvel Universe, it's flipped to another publisher.
Yeah, they lost the license. That is in 100% the thing that happened in both cases.
Yeah, which is why I'm not. We'll hit, I'm sure, on other shows, but this is why I'm like, I do not buy IP games, man.
On the other hand, if you really want to play a Marvel game and you really like Champions, you can somewhere out there on the internet. I'm not even hypothesizing. I've seen this. I just couldn't point you to it now. Of like the entire history of Marvel Comics converted to Champions. Somebody's already done the legwork if you really wanted to do that. And that's probably true for DC as well. Interestingly enough, and we're kind of in a golden age of superhero media right now in a way because of all the movies that are coming out. We're getting like 8 superhero movies a year or something crazy. I mean, Marvel's doing 3 or 4. I was always a Marvel guy, much more than DC. I never got into DC until I was like in light high school, and I wasn't in comics much longer than that. But to date, my favorite superhero movie remains the Richard Donner, Christopher Reeve Superman.
Is that the very first?
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot.
And I know it's not a perfect movie, but it's still my favorite.
I enjoy it. I've never I've tried real hard with the current wave of Marvel films, and they're just too.
it's a lot just to keep up with at this point.
Right. I did not like. I kind of didn't like the X-Men films. They didn't do it for me either.
I like the second one. The second one I thought was very
Yeah.
good. The first one was okay.
They're different. They're different experiences than role playing. It's just a different media.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a different media. But in terms of films, yeah, I like the first Superman film. I like the second Superman film with Christopher Reeves. I'm a big proponent for the first Batman with Michael Keaton.
That's a good movie.
I'm a big don't like Batman Returns or anything that was done afterwards. What's his name? Nolan did a great job with his run. Yeah.
That's actually a good brings up a good point though, is to take, that's the same characters, right? That Dark Knight the Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight with Heath Ledger as the Joker, right? And then you got the first joke, the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton, Jack Nicholson Joker movie. I mean, it's a great example of the wildly different ways you can interpret tonally, basically the same source material.
Yeah, it's superhero. I think my advice to one of the pluses about running a homebrew superhero campaign is you can actually get a lot of. So there's this myth out there that we have a session 0, right? And all the players, you're the game master, and all the players tell you what they want in the campaign, and then you're going to run it for them, and that never happens. You've got to run the fiction. You're the one doing the work. This guy can like, pistachio. This guy can like vanilla. But what you can do in a superhero campaign is, by these oil stain approaches, really give the characters a way to help build the history of that universe. Use those disadvantages and enemies from the past and things that are going on. You know what I mean? To help flesh out that world as you build it. And if you take that staggered campaign approach, they're really helping to build a universe. I've seen that done in superheroes far more intensively than I have in other types of campaigns, where I think because that character's built, like you were saying, superheroes about characters. So it's about this guy's, or this person's spouse. What's their day job? How is their day job parlaying into this? Oh, it becomes a subplot for things. May enemy. How do the supervillains come about? All that sort of thing really bumps up into what the player character is doing, what their story is, how their story evolves, and making the character. I think in a way that's much tougher to do if you're building like a fantasy campaign, or if you're doing, a science fiction campaign where you're going to try to bring the character's backstory and stuff into the campaign, but to construct the world, tougher. But this is really helping to build the world in this sense.
Yeah. And Champions was doing that from day one, right? With things like dependents and things like that, where it would be an NPC dependent that you would frequently, it was an actual die roll associated with this. Like how often they would end up getting kidnapped by the bad guy or in other, somehow placed in jeopardy based on the situation. And then you, the game master, would make those rolls, presumably session by session, and figure that out. And that was built in. And GURPS leaned a lot in its initial design, I think, independently of its genesis in the fantasy trip. It also leaned a lot on Champions, and that's why Steve Jackson said, "Hey, thanks Champions for having all these great ideas."
I mean, if you're a real GURPS and hero system head, both of them do everything, almost in exactly the same way. There's this real under the hood part, like we were talking earlier about the ludography that says, okay, this works better here, but this works better here, but all those functions. So yeah, oh, you have an enemy. Is it a secret enemy? Do they want, are they just harassing you? Do they want to kill you? Do you have a secret? All those things and the disadvantages are just work magnificently in the superhero genre, So
that's what they were designed to emulate.
So,
and I'm not sure there's another example of a really robust, like comprehensive points-based character creation prior to Champions. I can't think of one.
No, and GURPS is really your other option, and that's why back to what we started with the one shots. Like if I was doing a one shot, I think I'd rather use something like, PBTA or something like that, where we're kind of doing some storytelling and we're doing some quick, because this isn't going to last that long. So to do, if we're doing a campaign, well, then it's kind of worth the investment to figure out what do I want to use or not use in this campaign. Sitting around talking, making characters and letting the characters evolve the universe, discussing, hey, do we want to do a city today? What approach, how do we, let's build a universe, guys. How do we want to do this campaign? And then implementing it, that's a lot more work. And I think using the point-based systems is only worth it if you're going to implement that kind of work. If you're just going to do something short, use an indie, or if you got 5 players like, we want to play Marvel Universe today, like from the movies, so buy that game. Spend the $75, and know that the game won't be worth playing in like 5 years.
Yeah. Now I haven't looked at that new Marvel game at all. Right. I was aware it was coming. I know it's out, or just it's about to come out, or whatever. But I mean, I assume, and it's a huge missed opportunity if I'm wrong here, that you could pretty much drop it right into the movies and just, play the movie Marvel role-playing game, right? I think it would be a absolutely stupid design decision for them to not support that from the get-go.
Yeah, it's a business decision. And like, I don't want to go too far afield for very long from the superhero genre, but yeah, it's why I don't do any IP games. Like if you buy Free League's Alien, what are you getting? You're getting something where you're going to make an Alien movie. Well, how long do you want to run a campaign in that? There's no world out there.
I think there's actually different options for specifically designing your thing as a one shot in that. I haven't really looked at it particularly though. So it's just the hot new licensed IP game that's out.
I've looked. There's no world. There's no world there. You know what I mean? So it's like there's framing from playing an Alien movie. Well, Alien kind of got bad at the third movie.
It got bad at some point. I think the only thing we're going to differ is exactly when that shark got
right. So that's the issue with IP games. You're going to play until the shark jumps. And you're not. And there's an extra level of energy also if you're building your own world that the players bring to it if they're helping to create a universe, right? It's not like, what I mean? They're, what if this person gets hurt, but his best friend becomes a super, all the stuff that happens in comic books. There's a lot of room for maneuver and growth, And
as an aside, I'll mention that there is first of all, if somebody's aware of a superhero powered by the apocalypse game, please mention it in the comments, because I think I'd be interested to see that, even if I wasn't necessarily interested in playing it. But also, there's definitely a future show in the topic of licensed games and whether, or actually, there's two future shows in the works on this. One is licensed IP games, and one is games that are no longer supported by their publisher. Are they still worth playing? I don't know. I'd like to explore that.
Well, I know this much. I was in a group where the most successful IP games we ever played were Star Trek, when FASA still had the license. It was essentially because FASA had it forever, and it was almost like Paramount forgot they had the license.
Yeah.
So they were able to build materials and backstory stuff that the canon purists would freak out about later and whatever, and you could support a campaign. And once they were like, oh my God, they were like, what are these people doing? And took the license away. And I've never liked a Star Trek game or wanted to invest in one since, because they never have it long enough. And it's always, it spoiled me on WotC very early on in the game, because if you recall, they had that some Star Trek. What was it called? Anyway,
we'll talk about that on the Star Trek or Last Unicorn Games show, which will be about 5 minutes.
That's it. Last Unicorn is who I was thinking of.
I remember that. I fucking hated that game. What a naked, pants down money grab that was. Anyway, so let's thank you for the suggestions, but so let's
Gary,
yes.
I think it's time for the last word.
We could be time for the last word. Very good.
I think it's time for the last word, but audience, remember, if you have a question, please write question all in caps and write a question on this discussion. We'll try to get to it at the end of the show. So, Gary, what's your last word on superhero genre of games?
So it isn't in a lot of ways a challenging genre to manage, right? Because you're generally not. I mean, maybe it's a gritty, realistic superhero game, but even if that's the case, you may well have characters with insane high power levels, even if it's gritty and realistic. So, and that in and of itself represents a challenge. In addition, if you are using a points-based superhero engine, then you have to be cognizant of creative player interpretations of the powers, for example, which is one reason why in, say, Champions, the mechanics allow you to build specific interpretations of the powers that are those are the powers you design. And if you want to interpret it some other way, you have to build a new power and then go pay for that in character points, right? I think there's a number of different ways to approach it, but I think what I would refer back to is I think the field is wide open for game systems for one shot or, small number of shot formats, right? One shots or mini campaigns or whatever. But if you really want to try to, from my standpoint, I'm not saying any approach is wrong, but from my standpoint, if I was going to try to run an open-ended RPG campaign in the superhero genre, I would almost certainly do a fair amount of legwork up front on that to kind of try to flesh out the universe over and above what the characters have come up with, or the players have come up with for their characters. And I would also almost certainly lean into one of those points systems, either GURPS or Hero, and there's probably others that I'm just not remembering particularly, that as the mechanical basis for that game. So, Pat, what's your last word?
If you're gonna IP, buy the IP that interests you, play that. So that's part one of my answer. Part two is if you're gonna do a short shot, I would definitely find something PBTA game and do a short shot series of short shots. If you're going to do a campaign, sit down and don't think you're going to make characters in one night. Sit down virtually or in real life and discuss and say, what do we want to do? We're going to do a superhero campaign. It's worth having the hour out of your time meeting to discuss what you guys want to do, how you want to go about it. And if the game master is amenable, then to your point, once he's like got his mind right about what he wants to use, I suggest he uses champions. Unless they come up with like a Doctor Strange campaign and you say, whoa, what about GURPS? Then you need to go back with them and you need to make a character with every single one of those people. Sit down with them and make it. You'll understand how the powers work. The decisions you've made about tone and setting. You'll be able to make sure things keep aligned there. When they use their disadvantages, you'll understand them. It'll help inspire you to things. You follow what I'm saying. All that sort of thing to really build out that universe and do it that way. So that's my last word. If you're going to do anything lengthy of any time, use a point-based system, and you need to be very hands-on in the character creation. Once you guys have all agreed on, we're going to do this, be it a pulp campaign, a golden age campaign, a San Francisco 1979 campaign, or a Star City in 2040 campaign. Everything about that, and putting that thing together. So that's my last word on superhero genre of role-playing games.
We only have a couple of questions, so let's get to those. And this was explained in the comments a little bit. So Palladium has this thing where there are a couple of different kinds of damage in their original Palladium fantasy system. There's like hit points damage and there's SDC. And I think it still worked like this at the time, and it definitely does in later games. SDC kind of represents structure, where hit points represents health, and I may or may not be getting all the terminology right. But Rifts and SDC as like standard damage something.
I got you.
Okay,
so played on the role playing game had hit points. Everything after that had this thing called structural damage capacity. Okay, and that was like they equated to hit points. Armor would have structural damage capacity. Then when they IP licensed Robotech stuff from, Macross and whatnot, they determined that the mecha, each one of those, I believe, I forget the number, but it's 100 or 1,000 SDC equals MDC.
I thought it was 100.
Right. However, SDC weapons, like a pistol, don't affect an MDC thing. So I can shoot all day long with a weapon that does, or power, or you name it, that does SDC, and it won't affect a mega damage capacity creature. But mega damage is like 2 mega damage is like, I forget, 200, 2,000, whatever. And then they ported that over to their game system Rifts. This discussion, and even this question that Crossing Obstacles lays out, is like, I will definitely be part of when I, rip out my gutting knife and start to like go after Palladium later, because this is a mess. What I'm describing is a complete sprawling, moving from thing to thing mess. And that's the problem with the Palladium system. What's our next question, Gary?
Next question. There's only one more, and that is, does D&D 5th edition count as a superhero game?
I think not. I think it's genre. We were just talking about this before the stream. Its genre is power fantasy. So, you could kind of like go at making a superhero, I guess, in a power fantasy genre campaign. But like anything else, I think hacking or trying to change D&D 5e to play superheroes is like doing it to play science fiction. I'm going to be that gatekeeper guy. You're probably best off playing another game.
So here's where I think that's actually, I think, a more interesting question, because obviously the answer superficially is no. It's not. Correct. It's not the same genre, but there are some similarities between superheroes and D&D 5th edition specifically in terms of expectations for character fatalities. In a conventional superhero game, right? That's not going out of its way to murder everybody every 10 minutes. A number of characters, and by characters I mean player characters, so main characters that are going to get killed in any given session. The expectation is that that's not going to happen very often. Okay, that's also true in D&D 5th edition, and indeed this is a common tonal complaint that people have with D&D 5th edition. Is it's very relatively uncommon for characters to die. This is very much at odds with a variety of other older versions of D&D, and we'll have multiple episodes on D&D where we break this down. But I think the answer is no. But at the same time, you could draw some parallels between the structural narrative conventions of a superhero comic book and what the output of the D&D 5th edition algorithm is after you've sat down and played a campaign of it. I think there's something to be compared there.
I think it doesn't count as a superhero game, but I think I guess my last word on that is, I think if you wanted to make a cupcake baker who was invulnerable and had plot armor,
chef, a mad pastry chef. I made that character
who loved making cupcakes for everybody, but was also an artificer with a machine gun, who was a half orc. Then 5e is the game for you.
Sure, why not?
Right. That might be a superhero, and that might be superheroes these days. So,
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions, Gary?
We have no further questions.
So, are we done, Batman?
I think we're done, Boy Wonder. Please join us 2 weeks from now on July 10th for our next episode, which is Getting Meta, Time and Travel in RPG Campaigns. And we're on a 2-week schedule here. So we'll be, although there might be some kind of disruption, but generally the goal is a 2-week schedule. So goodbye, and keep your characters classless.